What if the most humiliating defeat of Putin's career wasn't on a battlefield, but in the quiet office of a leader in one of Europe's smallest countries, signed into law with nothing more than a pen? Right now, 1,500 Russian soldiers are stranded in a narrow strip of land with no supply lines, no legal right to be there, and no way home, and Moscow can do absolutely nothing about it. Before we go any further, if you want analysis that actually connects the dots on stories this important, hit that like button right now, subscribe so you never miss what's coming next, and send this to someone who thinks they already understand what's happening in Eastern Europe, because they don't. Not yet. Let's start with the moment everything changed. On April 8th, 2026, Moldovan President Maia Sandu signed a law. That's it. No military operation, no sanctions threat, no dramatic confrontation, just a signature. And with it, Moldova formally began its withdrawal from the Commonwealth of Independent States, the post-Soviet political club that Russia has used for over 30 years to maintain quiet control over former Soviet republics, dressed up as fraternal cooperation, functioning as a leash. This wasn't a sudden decision made in a moment of boldness. Moldova had been gradually cutting its legal ties to the CIS since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Dozens of bilateral agreements had already been canceled. Others were under review, but the April 8th signature was different. It was the final act, the one that made the break legally irreversible and internationally undeniable. And the impact didn't land first in Brussels or Washington. It landed in Moscow like something had collapsed beneath them. To understand why one small country signing one piece of legislation carries this much strategic weight, you have to understand a place most people in the West have never paid attention to: a thin, landlocked strip of territory called Transnistria. Transnistria sits squeezed between the Dnistru River and Ukraine's western border. It is not recognized as an independent country by a single United Nations member state. And yet, since a ceasefire in 1992, Russia has treated it as its own private military base, its most strategic outpost in all of Eastern Europe. For decades, Transnistria was Moscow's blind spot at the heart of Europe, a hub for intelligence operations, a staging ground for destabilization efforts across the region, a lever that kept both Ukraine and Moldova in a state of low-level anxiety, always aware that crossing Russia too far had a cost. And at the center of all of that sat 1,500 Russian soldiers. The Kremlin has called them peacekeepers for 3 decades. They are not. They are members of the operational group of Russian forces, a military unit that has been deployed in the region since that 1992 agreement. For 30 years, their presence was a silent message to Chisinau: move toward Europe and there will be consequences. They were the iron fist behind every diplomatic conversation, the reason Moldova always had to think twice. Moldova's CIS withdrawal just pulled the legal floor out from under every single one of them. Here's why that matters so precisely. The moment that law takes effect, there is no longer any recognized international framework, no CIS agreement, no mutually accepted treaty mechanism under which those Russian soldiers have any legal right to stand on Moldovan soil. They cross the line from a legally murky peacekeeping contingent into something much more damaging under international law: an illegal occupying force on the territory of a recognized European state. And Moldova didn't stop at the withdrawal law. The Moldovan government immediately declared the entire command structure of the Russian military group in Transnistria, every senior officer with authority over that unit, persona non grata on Moldovan-controlled territory. The moment any of those commanders tries to cross into Moldova proper, they will be detained and removed. The chain of command connecting Moscow to its soldiers on the ground has been severed, not by force, by law. Think about what this means in practical terms. Russian commanders can no longer physically coordinate on the ground. Supply convoys cannot enter from the Moldovan side. Air corridors are closed. The land borders of the region were already sealed by the geography of the war in Ukraine, and now Moldovan legal action has reinforced that seal and given it international legitimacy. What was once described by security analysts as Russia's most critical artery in Eastern Europe has become, In the assessment of Carnegie Endowment researchers writing in early 2026, a strategic dead end. And here's the detail that makes the whole picture even more sobering for Moscow. The vast majority of those 1,500 soldiers are not career Russian military officers who flew in from Moscow. Most of them are local men from the region, people who were simply handed Russian passports at some point and incorporated into the force. They have never lived in Russia, they have no extraction plan, they have no evacuation route, and they have no government willing to fight to bring them home. Russia is not protecting these men. It is abandoning them while calling them elite. Kirilo Budanov, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, has said publicly that Russia's contingent in Transnistria is militarily weak and that reinforcing it is now physically impossible. That assessment has not been seriously disputed. Even Russia's Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu made statements that sounded like threats but contained no actual mechanism for action, claiming that the lives of Russian citizens were under threat, issuing vague warnings about using all necessary methods if needed. Words from a country that has lost over 1 million casualties in Ukraine and cannot resupply 1,500 soldiers less than 200 kilometers from its own allies' border. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely alarming, not just geopolitically, but in terms of direct physical danger to the region. Underneath the ground where those isolated Russian soldiers stand sits one of the most dangerous things in all of Europe, a facility called the Cobasna Ammunition Depot. If you've never heard of Cobasna, you need to hear about it now. Located in the Robnica district of Transnistria, this is not a simple weapons warehouse. It is the largest illegal ammunition stockpile in Eastern Europe. It was built during the Soviet era, originally serving as the strategic arsenal for the USSR's Western Military District. When Soviet forces began withdrawing from East Germany and Czechoslovakia at the end of the Cold War, the munitions they couldn't take with them came here. Artillery shells, tank rounds, tens of millions of cartridges, all of it piled into warehouses in a territory with no internationally recognized government and no mechanism for international oversight. The current stockpile at Cobasna contains somewhere between 20,000 and 22,000 tons of Soviet-era weapons and ammunition. Of that total, more than half has already passed its expiration date, obsolete, chemically unstable, and completely inaccessible to international inspectors who have been blocked from conducting inspections for over 15 years. In 2015, the Academy of Sciences of the Republic of Moldova published an expert analysis with a conclusion that demands attention. A full detonation at Cobasna, they determined, would produce destructive force equivalent to the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, a crater 1.5 kilometers wide and 75 meters deep. The resulting catastrophe would extend across tens of kilometers in every direction, deep into Moldova, into Ukraine, potentially reaching the Romanian border. Even a partial detonation, according to separate expert assessments, could produce a blast comparable to the 2020 Beirut port explosion, an event that killed over 200 people, injured thousands more, and leveled an entire district of a major city. Russia has maintained this depot for 30 years, not as a storage problem to be responsibly managed, but as a geopolitical hostage. Moscow has systematically vetoed every international initiative to dispose of or remove the ammunition, including proposals brought forward by the OSCE, which has kept Cobasna on its highest priority monitoring list for years. The depot wasn't just a liability in Russia's military calculations, it was an asset, a permanently armed threat they could always hold over the region, a sword of Damocles that never needed to fall to be effective, it only needed to exist. But Moldova's CIS withdrawal changes that calculation fundamentally. Russia has now been stripped of its legal justification for maintaining troops at Kobazna. That means the international community has far stronger grounds than ever before to demand access, inspection, and controlled dismantlement of the stockpile. Moldova can go to the OSCE, to the United Nations, to the European Union, and make an argument it could not fully make before. Not just that it wants Russia to leave, but that Russia has no legal right to be there. The depot that served as Russia's instrument of pressure has become Russia's biggest liability, a decaying, destabilizing problem it has no way to manage and no legal authority to protect. You're now about halfway through this story, and we're just getting to the part that may matter most. Before we go there, here's what I want you to do. Take 10 seconds, go to your contacts, and send this video to one person who follows geopolitics. Don't just share it to your story. Actually, send it directly. The conversations that come from that are exactly what this kind of analysis is built for, and if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good time. The next chapters of this story are coming fast. Let's zoom out from Transnistria and look at the larger picture. Because what Moldova has done is not just a single tactical maneuver, it's the most visible sign yet of a country that made a permanent, irreversible choice about its future, and has been executing that choice with a discipline and patience that has left Moscow without a single effective tool of pressure. Since 2022, Moldova has been systematically neutralizing every instrument Russia traditionally used to keep it in line. When Russia threatened to cut natural gas, the classic energy blackmail that Moscow deployed across Eastern Europe for decades, Chisinau didn't panic. Instead, the Sandu administration worked to integrate Moldova into Europe's energy grid, removing Moscow's ability to hold the country's heating and electricity hostage. The blackmail weapon wasn't defeated by confrontation. It was rendered irrelevant by connectivity. On the EU integration front, Moldova's foreign ministry was direct when introducing the CIS withdrawal bill, calling it a natural and inevitable step toward EU membership. European Parliament members went further, noting publicly that the CIS had functioned as a mechanism to continue Soviet-era control over member states, an organization that had failed to prevent conflicts or protect smaller members from coercive behavior by its dominant power. The European Union has responded to Moldova's choices with something concrete: money and commitment. The EU approved a 1.9 billion euro growth plan for Moldova covering 2025 to 2027, the largest standalone financial support package ever extended to the country, representing close to 10% of Moldova's entire annual economic output. This is not symbolic. These are infrastructure investments, energy security upgrades, military modernization funds, cybersecurity systems, a comprehensive economic shield designed to make Russian financial coercion permanently obsolete. From 2021 to 2025 alone, the EU allocated over 1.2 billion euros in grants to Moldova. And Moldova is moving at a pace that has surprised even optimistic observers. According to EU Commission officials, Moldova completed its bilateral screening process in just 15 months, described as making it the fastest moving EU candidate in history. Accession negotiations could conclude as early as the end of 2027. A membership target date of 2030 is now seriously on the table. Brussels is no longer talking about Moldova as a buffer zone. It is talking about Moldova as an indispensable strategic partner, a fortress at Europe's most exposed eastern edge. But now we come to the dimension of this story that may genuinely have changed Putin's sleep. In January 2026, during an interview published by Reuters, Moldovan President Maia Sandu said something that sent shockwaves from Bucharest to Brussels to Moscow. She stated that if a referendum were held, she would personally vote for unification with Romania. She explained her reasoning plainly. Small countries are finding it harder and harder to survive as democracies and resist Russian pressure, and the calculus of what options are available is shifting. Let that sink in. The sitting president of Moldova, re-elected in November 2024, despite documented Russian interference in that election, including attempted voter manipulation, publicly said she would vote to dissolve her country's independent statehood and merge with Romania. Romania, which is both a NATO member and an EU member state. This was not campaign rhetoric. It was a strategic signal delivered on multiple frequencies simultaneously. A message to Bucharest about where Chisinau's orientation lies. A message to Brussels about the depth of Moldova's European commitment, and a message to NATO and the Pentagon. If the standard path gets blocked, If Hungarian obstruction slows EU accession, if Russian pressure intensifies, there is a plan B, a fast lane to both NATO and EU protection that bypasses the standard accession queue entirely, and that lane runs straight through Romania. To be precise about where public opinion currently stands, polling in Moldova shows approximately 29% of Moldovans supporting a formal merger with Romania that would end independent statehood. That number has been relatively stable. President Sandu herself has acknowledged that EU integration as an independent state remains the more realistic near-term objective. In Romania, a majority, around 56%, support unification according to recent polling, but that is not the same as a mandate or an immediate political program. Romania's President Nicusor Dan has suggested the two countries pursue deeper integration through Moldova's EU accession process rather than a formal referendum on merger, so unification is not imminent. It may not happen at all in the near term, but strategically, what matters is that the option exists publicly on the table, that a sitting president has said it out loud, that both countries' infrastructure and legal frameworks are being steadily interlocked, and that Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov responded by calling it a destructive plan that would destroy the Moldovan state. Panic-filled language from a ministry that has spent months watching every single instrument of coercion in Moldova dismantled one by one. Now let's look at what's happening inside Transnistria itself, because this is the level of analysis that most coverage skips, and it's where the slow motion collapse becomes most visible. The separatist administration in Tiraspol has survived for over 3 decades on a very specific combination of factors: Russian military protection, free Russian natural gas flowing through Ukrainian pipelines, and the psychological weight of Moscow's implicit threat. Every single one of those pillars has now been knocked away. The gas was the first to go. When Ukraine stopped the transit of Russian gas through its pipelines at the start of 2025, Transnistria lost the subsidized energy that had effectively funded a significant portion of its budget for years. The enormous Soviet-era power plant that once made Transnistria a net electricity exporter shifted to coal just to keep the lights on. The economic model that sustained the separatist administration through 3 decades of international isolation has collapsed. The demographic picture is equally stark. Transnistria's population of roughly 500,000 has been declining for years. Young people, educated, mobile, often holding Moldovan or Romanian passports, are leaving. EU visa liberalization arrangements give them somewhere better to go. What remains is an aging population, a hollowed-out economy, and a separatist administration with no real constituency among anyone under 40. Russia's supposed stronghold in Eastern Europe is being depopulated from the inside. And then there's the dimension that rarely makes headlines but may matter as much as any formal diplomatic milestone: the informal economic networks. Russia's presence in Transnistria was never purely about soldiers and ammunition. It was about money, specifically the gray market trade routes and arms flows that allowed Russian-linked interests to operate in ways largely invisible to Western regulators. The Cobasna depot, beyond being a weapons stockpile, has been documented by researchers as a reported hub for illicit arms flows to conflict zones across Africa and the Middle East. These were the unofficial economic arteries keeping Moscow's shadow presence alive. Every step Moldova takes toward EU regulatory and legal standards closes those channels. EU anti-money laundering frameworks, EU customs regulations, EU border control systems. Each advancement toward Brussels is a move that makes the informal networks harder to sustain. This is the part that doesn't trend on social media, but may outlast every headline we've discussed today. Russian foreign ministry officials have responded to all of this with what amounts to a stalling strategy, arguing that discussions about troop withdrawal require first resolving the underlying conflict on terms Russia finds acceptable. In other words, we created this problem, and we'll only talk about leaving when you agree to a resolution we approve. It's a circular argument. and it carries considerably less weight now that the legal architecture beneath Russia's position has been dismantled. EU foreign policy officials have been explicit that any serious ceasefire or peace framework involving Ukraine must now include a Transnistria component, specifically the question of what Russia intends to do with soldiers who are legally trespassing on the soil of a sovereign European state in the process of joining the European Union. Russia cannot resolve Ukraine diplomatically while ignoring the question of 1,500 men. It has no legal right to station where they stand. Here's what this all adds up to. Putin has watched a country of 2.4 million people methodically dismantle every lever of influence he had built over 3 decades, and he has done so without a single effective counter. Energy blackmail neutralized by connectivity, military coercion legally dismantled by treaty withdrawal, economic pressure offset by EU funding that dwarfs anything Russia could offer. Information warfare and election interference run aggressively in Moldova's 2024 elections, and still failing to prevent Sandu's re-election or the parliamentary majority that followed in September 2025. Every tool was tried, every tool failed, and now Russia sits with 1,500 stranded soldiers it cannot resupply, cannot reinforce, and cannot legally defend. It holds a decaying ammunition depot it has no right to guard and cannot remove. It watches a country it once treated as controllable transform itself into a European strategic asset, rapidly, deliberately, and without looking back. This is the nature of the defeat that doesn't appear on military maps. It doesn't come with a dramatic moment, a surrendered flag, or a final battle. It comes through laws, through alliances, through the patient and methodical construction of a future that leaves no room for Russian leverage. Moldova didn't win a war against Russia. It made itself legally, economically, and institutionally unreachable. And in doing so, it may have shown every small country living in Russia's shadow exactly how it's done. The pen that President Sandu used on April 8th was not just signing Moldova out of the CYS. It was signing a template, proof that a small, determined country with the right partnerships and the right patience can make itself free from an empire that is accustomed to getting what it wants through fear. That lesson is being read right now in every capital that has spent decades calculating whether the cost of resistance is worth it. And the answer Moldova just wrote is yes. The cost of resistance is survivable. The cost of staying within reach is not. The map of Eastern Europe is being redrawn quietly, legally, irreversibly, and it is happening entirely to Moscow's loss in ways that no military operation could reverse, because no military operation is what caused it. Watch what Moldova does next, because the next chapter of this story is already being written.